Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of the School of PE's weekly podcast. I got an exciting guest returning here today, and Mr. Dustin Douglas, PE. So, Dustin, welcome back, and how are you today?
Hey, thanks, Chris. I'm doing great. Thank you.
All right, well, we have an exciting topic today. We're going to kind of talk about the effects of material costs and how it increases in construction. So, you don't have to be an engineer, you don't even have to be in construction to kind of understand what's going on. I mean, maybe you're renovating your house or adding a patio if you're in one of the warmer states and you've probably felt this crunch. But today we got a specialist to kind of talk us through it and, have some fun with it. So, again, Dustin, thanks for coming. If you want
Hey,
to kind of rehash or recap and reintroduce yourself, I guess, to the audience, just to remind them of who you are.
okay, sounds good. Again, my name is Dustin Douglas. I live in Texas. I work for a company called GeoPeer Foundation Company. I am a PE, and I cover Texas and Louisiana for GeoPeer, and I'm licensed in both Texas, Louisiana, as well as Arkansas.
All right, very good. It's kind of those like so southwestern states, I guess, more or less. Very
Yeah.
nice. So Texas, how is it out there these days? Starting to cool off a little bit, or what are you experiencing for this Thanksgiving holiday?
Yeah, the last few weeks it's been getting cooler. We've had some cool fronts coming in, so it's starting to feel more like fall. And it kind of still ebbs and flows. I mean, anybody who knows Texas weather knows you can have a blizzard in the morning and a heat stroke in the afternoon. But it's been nice, good weather that you would anticipate in the fall, getting into winter.
That's nice. That's how it is out here in Ohio as well. It was a long, hot, muggy summer. So looking forward to a little bit cooler weather. So the whole COVID pandemic has kind of thrown things into a whirlwind over the last 18 months or so. You see everything from price increases to shortages, from everything from, food to supplies. You could walk into a grocery store and see the shelves empty. Sometimes that could be due to just not having the product, but also sometimes it's due to labor shortages and not having people fill the shelf. So, if I recall a few months ago, I had some friends looking to renovate their house, and they're like, "Holy cow, man! Costs were just so much higher than they would have been, let's say, 24 months sooner or earlier." And a lot of it has to do with maybe supply chain issues or just cost and materials increasing. So I've heard about, like, when it comes to some of these costs, the cost of wood, 2x4s have increased, metals increased. So maybe you can get into more of the specifics of like what specific materials are experiencing these cost increases.
I would say you hit it pretty well, Chris. I mean, in my experience, most notably, it's been steel and timber. Now, with my line of work, I do aggregate piers, and so I've even seen some, notable material price increase on aggregate. And so I'm not certain that there's that many, basically supply chains that haven't been affected by the pandemic.
Right, I agree. I was in LA not too long ago, and the port of Los Angeles is a huge port, right?
Hmm.
Man, they had, I mean, I think they had, I don't know, some 60 some cargo ships or something lined up. And they said that if you
Jeez,
were to take each container off the ship and lay them, one in front of the other, you could go from LA to Chicago.
that's
So,
incredible.
yeah, I mean, that's crazy, man, from West Coast to the Midwest. So, a lot of people, I guess, kind of have their own ideas and thoughts of what some of these material cost increases could be because of. And, what do you think's the number one cause of materials cost increase?
I think the one of the big drivers was the pandemic. I think it kind of caused a bottleneck that resulted in basically all at one time a really substantial increase in global demand in the construction sector. And then I think you combine that with some other nuances, and some of the complexities and the impacts of the pandemic and some logistic issues. And I think it's resulted in these unprecedented shortages and then delays also from transport. We're having labor issues. If you listen to the news, it seems like everybody, you not even listen to the news, you just walk outside in front of some businesses and you'll see people are needing help. And so all of these things I think have contributed to this really historic price hike that we've seen on materials.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you're right. It's maybe a combination of a few things, maybe COVID plus, also though, if you think about it, we have these tariffs, that are applied to certain goods, right? I know steel
Mhm.
has one, and so it encourages, U.S. steel. And so when you have that on top of the pandemic slowing things down, I think you get like a double whammy. And so, what other factors do you think that can influence it? We have COVID, we have the tariffs. What do you think about maybe any foreign relations with other countries that kind of affect this um, cost increase?
Yeah, absolutely. So the foreign, I'd say, political tensions,
Hmm.
that definitely plays a role. And it actually, you said tariffs a moment ago, and that you're exactly right. Those go hand in hand.
Right.
Something that the Trump administration
Mhm.
imposed a few years ago, back in 18. I mean, the Trump administration was basically imposing steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the EU, and then eventually China.
Mhm.
And I think that had a direct, I mean, without a doubt, had a direct effect on the cost of steel in particular.
No, I agree. No, that's some good thoughts that you shared. So, one thing that nobody seems to ever be able to escape is good old Mother Nature. So, do you think any of the Mother Nature has had an effect on some of these increases? And if so, maybe you can elaborate on that.
Oh, it definitely has, and I think it depends on where you live.
Hmm.
I think for our neck of the woods down south, I think hurricanes and floods definitely affect. Can have an effect. Again, I go back to transport. When roads are flooded and you can't get around, it causes a bottleneck again in the transport capabilities. And then, if you're talking about maybe further west, when you get the wildfire season, that can affect timber
Right.
and the ability, the ability of being able to get products that you normally have access to. So absolutely, Mother Nature definitely plays a role.
No, I agree with you, Dustin. Sometimes I think Mother Nature kind of has it twofold, meaning like, it could affect production, but it also could, as you mentioned, could affect transportation as well. So maybe you have the forest fires which will slow down production on some things, and then maybe like you said, roads flooding, things like that. For transportation becomes an issue. So I think Mother Nature gives you a 1-2 punch there. um, you know Talking about costs, especially in increases, is never fun, right? Nobody
Yeah.
wants to talk about that because somebody always has to bear the burden of these cost increases. So,
Yeah.
for example, let's say you run a construction company, and I hire you to build a home. So, you're obviously not going to front all those cost increases. So, I mean, who do you think gets the shorter end of the stick when it comes to these cost increases, and who burdens them the most?
I definitely think you were doing some foreshadowing there. I think it's the consumer, without a doubt, because businesses, they may see a drop in profit margins unless they basically raise prices, and then they can defend the raising in prices on, hey, look, last year, the cost per ton of this amount of aggregate, for instance, was this. It's gone up, 33%. So as a result, we're having to raise our prices. And as a result, I think I think consumers end up being on the hook. And what's unfortunate is sometimes those raises in price that consumers now have to bear to pay for their goods sometimes isn't commensurate with the amount of money that they're making, because I think consumers oftentimes are still making the same salary or hourly wage that they were making the year prior. So it can definitely have a burden on the consumer, in my opinion.
No, and I agree with you. And I think sometimes we see things from a more from a consumer point of view because we often play that role ourselves, and you can see in everything from you go to a fast food restaurant, you've
Yeah.
seen price increases, maybe not due to shortages in the goods, but maybe shortages in labor. So they've had to increase prices. So we see it every day. I mean, it's hard to avoid. Um, so there's whenever let's take the pandemic or tariffs aside, and let's look at a cost increase from a different perspective. So, you know, whenever you increase price, whether let's say you own a lemonade stand, and you were selling lemonade for 25, and this is going way back probably to the 80s prices, but 25 cents a cup. And you decide, I'm selling a lot of lemonade at this price. Maybe I could increase it to 50 cents. So, what kind of repercussions do you see on the materials when you increase a cost?
Well, I mean, for my industry, again, it ends up resulting in an increase in basically lump sum contract price. It happens all the time on my jobs in particular because my jobs always include the cost of material for aggregate, and so when the aggregate prices increase, it just equates to higher lump sum costs. And I think the increases, they can reduce demand to an extent. I haven't seen a big drop in demand in my line of work, but at the same time, I do think demand can result, in some projects getting delayed or shelved. And so I think that can have a bit of an effect on the demand if they can put it off. But really, there's individual sectors I think that suffer more than others in terms of demand. For one, for instance, I'd say the hospitality sector. They really slowed down, after the pandemic hit because people weren't traveling. So all of a sudden there wasn't a demand to build as many hotels because they weren't filling the hotels that were already standing. And so there's a lot of little nuances like that I think, can affect demand, for instance.
No, no, and I think you hit the nail on the head there, Dustin. So, you kind and this might get us a little bit off topic, but you mentioned lump sum contracts. So there's so many different types of contracts. You have the time materials, you have fixed price. So can you maybe expand on I guess the characteristics of a lump sum contract are?
Absolutely. And in our situation, it's basically a contract that gives you one lump sum total for everything offered under the umbrella of that contract. For instance, in my line of work, that's going to provide engineering for the system that we're providing. It's going to provide the materials that are included in the actual construction process. It's going to include the field testing, the testing that actually takes place on the production piers. And then, it also obviously handles anything, clerical, the stuff that has to be done, just to get paperwork done and the contract, itself. And so all those together make up the lump sum price. And yeah.
No, that makes sense. So it sounds like a lump sum contract has some built-in risk, meaning like, you say, hey, Chris, I'm going to charge you X dollars for this contract, right?
Yes.
But what happens if your materials costs rise? Then are you going to have to be the one that burdens the majority of that increase in cost? Or, do you end up reducing the scope of the contract? Or what are some of the things that you can do to alleviate, I guess, some of those burdens that you carry because you are operating under a lump sum contract?
Well, one thing that we do in particular is we'll actually include a timeline for how good that contract is valid for. Be it 90 days, 180 days. That's one way we can protect ourselves as a business from exactly what we're talking about, material price increase in particular. That way, if I provided you a proposal last March, for instance, March of 2020, and the cost per foot for my system was $5 lower than it is now, but that $5 is almost entirely a result of the price of aggregate. Well,
Right.
guess what? We can't just eat that in our profits. So we have to raise and reevaluate our price. And our clients normally are very understanding of that. But
Sure.
sometimes, especially when a project's been shelved, it is a hard conversation and an uncomfortable one to have
Yeah.
to say, that was last year, and the price has gone up excess amount of dollars.
Right. No, and that makes sense. Like you said, hey, I'll give you a 90-day price guarantee or whatever it might be. But let's create a different scenario for you, Dustin. So let's say I signed on with you to do a job for my company for X dollars. The COVID hit. So we've signed the contract, right? Contract, we signed it, but you couldn't get the work started. And then all of a sudden, you couldn't do the ordering because, everything kind of just shut down. And now once things started opening up again, how do you adjust for those? Because let's say, just like what we've had, materials have increased, the cost of materials. So what do you do in terms of like contract signed, and then all of a sudden something comes up to where I guess it delays it because operations shut down, and then now you're like, oh man, the cost of these materials have just skyrocketed.
Yeah, well, that's when you have clauses in your contract. Specifically, there's a force majeure clause, which is basically a common clause that is in lots of contracts. It basically what it does is it frees both parties from their contractual obligations. If there is like an event or a
Mhm.
circumstance that's extraordinary, a pandemic is a prime example. It doesn't have to just be the pandemic, though, a war,
Right.
riots, whatever, but something that's an unforeseen, extraordinary event that causes both parties or even one person in a party to not be able to, basically live up to their side of the deal in the contract.
Makes sense. I appreciate you sharing some of the safeguards that are built into lump sum contracts. We kind of talked about usually supply and demand usually will help is what determines prices for the most part, right?
Mhm.
So usually as supply decreases, then you can expect a price increase, and usually you would see demand kind of dwindle as well, right? But as you had mentioned, maybe it's just because this is such a anomaly of a situation that we find ourselves in, that have the demand really hasn't slowed down, even with some of these materials just kind of skyrocketing. So I mean, you take the housing market for instance, and I mean, you put a house for sale one day, it's selling for $40,000 above the asking price the next day.
Yeah.
So I mean, we don't have to look just at the housing market, but what are some of the, I guess, things you can attribute to why it's kind of working in the reverse, meaning as prices are rising, not all demand has decreased.
I'll speak on the housing market first. The
Sure.
housing market is very unique, in my opinion, to the pandemic because the pandemic has just revolutionized the way that people are working now.
Mhm.
So many people, I don't know, I don't have the percentages in front of me, but the amount of people that were working from home prior to the pandemic pales in comparison to the amount of people that are now working from home post pandemic. And I say post pandemic loosely. I realize the
Right.
pandemic is still ongoing, but
Sure.
the brunt of last year's shock of the pandemic. And so that's created all kinds of new, a booming domestic housing market because, people need to work at home, so they're reassessing their housing needs, and there's a lot of remodeling being done to accommodate. And so I think the housing market is really, really unique in that regard. The other thing about the housing market that's interesting, right now, for instance, it is a seller's market. I mean, my house right now, it's everybody I think's tempted to sell their house because there's such a big profit, but it's a catch 22 because unless you are one of those people who have multiple properties and
Right.
you can buy and sell at a whim without actually having to move when you sell, you may sell your house for a large profit, but you're definitely not going to be able to get in a house right now without paying the premiums that are associated with the costs right now. So the housing market's definitely its own animal.
No, I agree. It's interesting. You talk about, hey, everyone's at least contemplating selling their house because they can see a huge profit. For example, my brother lives out in the Inland Empire out in Southern California. And so let's say he bought his house, I don't know, 20 years ago for $200,000, we'll say.
Mhm.
And now he's like, holy cow, my house is worth like 600,000. I'm like, yeah, that's great. But houses are now starting in the 700, 800. So, you're really not better in your position in any, except for maybe getting a newer home. So,
Yep.
but also, you touched on the working from remote having an effect on it as well. And you're right, because let's say you're a software engineer living in San Francisco, California, and your company says, hey, you can work remote every day, no plans to come back in the office. So this person's like, okay, well, I no longer need to live in the Bay Area. So maybe they're like, you know what, I'm going to go move to Boise, Idaho.
Yeah.
They take their salary with them, but they're paying Boise prices. So I think that has a lot to do with how come the housing is as crazy as it is.
That's a great point. Yes. Yes.
But yeah, I agree. Things have definitely changed in the last 24 months. What once people thought was impossible, working remote, is now almost the norm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see it to go. So thanks for kind of chiming in on that. Um, we talked about the housing market. In construction, I guess it's probably one of the heavier hit areas where these material prices increased have gone on. What are some of the ways that I guess manufacturers can navigate through these price increases to kind of weather the storm?
Well, one really great way, and this is very, this is something I'm a big advocate for because it affects my business. Value engineering.
Mm.
That's a buzzword that you'll hear a lot right now. Maybe more than you would have heard 24 months ago. Value engineering is big because I'll give you a prime example. In my line of work, I'm doing foundation support. So traditionally, if a person's wanting to, a group is wanting to support a really heavy structure,
Mhm.
they may, opt to traditionally use really long, deep foundations like timber piles,
Mhm.
80 to 100-foot long timber piles, or auger cast piles where there's just a lot of materials associated with the cost, and a lot of shaft length and depth to add to that scope in terms of linear footage. Same thing with steel and drilled shafts, that we're talking about, steel being a big player in the cost. Well, my in our systems particularly, we're building aggregate piers, so we're building piers out of stone. Well, if you look at the cost of steel and timber right now, 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been very competitive in a lot of areas of Louisiana, for instance, because Louisiana is I mean, they've been doing timber piles for a long time because that's something they have.
Right.
That's something that they can get for a very good price, good economy. And so I haven't historically been very, cost competitive. But with the timber hike, I've actually been winning a lot more work in Louisiana
Oh,
because
wow.
the cost in the hike in timber it doesn't equate to the cost in hike in aggregate. And so value engineering, if there's contractors listening to this, value engineering is a big way to do it, because just because the cost of materials price are going up doesn't necessarily mean your contract price has to go up on building your job. You may just have to get creative and try to think about some value engineering options.
No, that's interesting. That's a good point you make. So let me paint another scenario for you. So, as we've been discussing throughout this podcast, is, with the increase of materials, maybe sometimes, it starts to cut into your profit because you can't adjust for that maybe big of an inflation in price. So sometimes, people look to maybe use lower quality materials. Maybe they use used materials versus new materials. So
Mhm.
sometimes you might look into reducing the quality in order to maintain those same profit margins. So, in construction in those fields like that, I mean, is there a lot of substituting maybe I don't want to say a used materials versus brand new materials?
It's definitely something people look at, contractors look at when the goings get tough. We, for instance, have projects where if there is the availability of recycled concrete, for
Oh,
instance,
wow.
we'll look to, sometimes use recycled concrete in lieu of aggregate in our piers, because as far as the engineering is concerned, if the soil profile is right, it'll check out. I mean, recycled concrete oftentimes has a nice high friction angle, so it enables us to still build piers and get the type of pier capacities and performance that we require. So you're a great example. That would be an example of not buying more expensive aggregate when you have a stockpile of recycled concrete at your disposal.
Well, that makes sense. So, sometimes you can't really do anything to buffer or pad against materials increases, labor price increase. So, are there other ways or are there other solutions available to kind of help you, I guess, maybe manage costs when maybe you can't control labor costs and material costs to the point to where you want to?
I don't want to sound redundant, but I go back to value engineering, because sometimes it's not just replacing one material with another. Sometimes it's just more efficient design. I'll give you a prime example again. In my line of work, you'll have a structural engineer perhaps design a building for shallow foundations, okay, shallow footings, that's isolated and continuous footings. And if they design those footings to just bear on native soil that perhaps is maybe a little bit soft or loose and
Mhm.
has a low bearing pressure, basically a low bearing pressure design, what happens is the structural engineer ends up having to size his footings larger because the bearing pressure with unreinforced soil is lower. And so as a result, they have to have bigger footings, which is more concrete and more steel, reinforcement. And so we'll come in and we'll offer a rammed aggregate pier solution by, drilling holes, backfilling them with a high friction angle aggregate. And sure, there's a cost associated with the aggregate that you're now introducing into your project. However, as a result, the bearing pressure increases so much
Hmm.
that the structural engineer, instead of being able to design for, just for instance, 1500 PSF,
Hmm.
now the structural engineer can design for 6,000, 7,000 PCFs. And all of a sudden, a footing that was 8x8 is
Hmm.
now a 3x3, and these are just, examples. And when that happens, there is a good example of when just more efficient engineering, better design can help you offset the cost of materials price hike without having to basically take a hit on the quality of what you're building.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it seems like value engineering is something that people should, definitely take a look at and
Yep.
consider. No, I appreciate you sharing that. So, we talked about supply chains and how you're seeing supply chains affected across industries, right? I mean,
Mhm.
people are saying, hey, if you haven't ordered your Christmas presents now, they're probably not going to make it in time for the Christmas holiday. So, can you think of any construction supply chains that have remained unaffected by these price increases?
You know, I can't think of too many that have, if I'm being honest. Um, in fact, I think I'll answer the question with I think some have been affected less than others, in my opinion, because transport is pretty universal. And so, with the labor issues everybody's having right now, transport's a big deal. And so, if you've got local stock, basically local places that you can buy your materials from,
Mhm.
there's some price hike you might be able to avoid just because there's not as much of a transport, to get to point A to point B. And then just other materials that just haven't gone up as much as a result. I compare aggregate again to steel and timber, for various reasons. For instance, the
Sure.
tariff that we discussed on steel.
Right.
So I think some have less than others, but with the labor shortages, I think most have seen an increase.
No, and I agree with you. So, I got another question, and it might be a long-winded one, and I'll try to get to the meat of it. But so, a lot of times, people think materials have been, price of materials have been increased due to maybe lack of production. It's not being produced quick enough or in large enough quantities. So, I mean, do you think that, with these materials prices increasing so much, do you think they will end up maybe issuing an incentive to the producers to produce more to curtail the price increases?
I think so, and I think that lends itself more to larger companies than
Mm.
smaller companies because the bottom line is smaller companies, they may be willing, but they're going to be ultimately forced to accept smaller profit margins, for at least for a while. Larger companies have a little bit more flexibility
Right.
because here's one potential incentive that I'm just kind of coming up with off the top of my head, but I could see this as a very realistic, kind of a something that could happen. If one material supplier says, "Look, if you'll buy in bulk, we'll give you a discount."
Mhm.
Well, larger companies are going to be able to do that more because they
Right.
have more capital. And so I do think those incentives, we could see a rollout of those incentives. But at the same time, if you want to stay in business, I think you just kind of have to roll with the punches and try to batten down the hatches till it evens out a bit.
No, I agree. Try to ride this wave, and you're right. Sometimes larger companies have an advantage because they have more capital, so they can maybe ride the wave out longer than some of the smaller companies can. So
Mhm.
today we had an interesting topic. We talked about the effects of materials cost increases, not just in construction, but we kind of had some fun with some other industries as well. Whenever I do a podcast near the end, I try to have a little bit of fun with the guest, and if I recall, not only are you an engineer, you are a musician as well. So, how's music life treating you as of late?
Music's good. I haven't been playing as many local shows with my band lately, but yeah, I always have something going on artistically in my spare time. And my main thing I'm doing now is I've really come into my own with some TikTok voiceovers. Um,
I'm gonna check those out. So,
yeah, I do a lot of those now, and my TikTok following has grown a lot. I've got almost 400,000 followers now on TikTok, so
oh
that's what I like to do.
yeah, I'll have to check those out. They sound like a lot of fun. So, we're in the holiday season. Thanksgiving's just a couple of days away. So, Any fun Thanksgiving traditions out there in Texas that you partake in?
Oh, well, I mean, we've got the age-old, wishbone where, when you get to the wishbone part, when you're carving the turkey, one person grabs each side
Yep.
and you make a wish, and whoever gets, it breaks in two, and whoever's got the larger piece of the wishbone, their wish comes true. Um, Other than that, Christmas is when my family's particular traditions come into play. We normally have a Swedish meatball
Oh,
Christmas Eve because
man.
my grandmother immigrated to the U.S. From Sweden, came straight to Ellis Island, and with her, she brought a lot of Swedish traditions. So that's what we do.
Swedish meatballs sound fantastic. I was actually speaking of Swedish meatballs. I was just in an IKEA not
Okay.
too
Yep.
long ago, and they're known for their meatballs or whatever. So that's the last time I actually had any Swedish meatballs. So let me ask you this: favorite Thanksgiving dish, turkey, ham, or something else?
I think I'd have to say my favorite Thanksgiving dish is probably I like corn stuffing. I'm a
Okay.
big fan of that. As far as the main course, I love dark meat turkey with some gravy. Yeah,
Oh yeah, give me a turkey leg, pile on that gravy. So,
you got it.
but hey, Dustin, I appreciate you coming out for another episode. I'd love to have you back. I'd love to delve more into contract talk, really, especially in construction. As we mentioned, there's so many different types of contracts, each having their own, I guess, pluses and minuses, and some serve a purpose in certain situations better than others. So maybe we can chat about that. But any last words of wisdom to share with the audience before we wrap it up?
No, I would just say for everybody out there, just hang in there. I mean, we don't know exactly when this, is going to last till. I mean, I've seen people saying it'll last probably till late 2022, but you never know. We'll just have to wait and see. But I would definitely encourage people to, flex the muscle. The engineers out there, flex the muscle of efficiency, and just keep open mind to value engineering options because they're out there. You just have to go find them.
I like those words of wisdom. So, to the rest of you out there, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving holiday. Be safe, eat a lot, and enjoy the rest of the week. And Dustin, thanks for coming out again today and spending some time with me. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thanks, Chris. I really enjoyed it. Happy Thanksgiving to you and yours.
You as well.